There are moments in sports that seem small on the surface, but carry an enormous amount of weight underneath. A glance across the court, a reaction on the bench that lasts only a second or two, a comment made in front of a microphone that most people forget by the next morning. These moments rarely make the front page. They rarely get their own highlight package. But sometimes, if you pay close enough attention, they tell you more about a team's true identity than any box score ever could. That's exactly what happened when Kelsey Mitchell rose into a contested three-pointer against the New York Liberty, absorbed contact mid-release, and watched the ball fall cleanly through the net. The building erupted, the fever bench erupted, and Caitlin Clark, several feet away, not even directly in the play, erupted in a way that cameras caught clearly and fans immediately clipped, shared, and dissected across every platform imaginable. It was a few seconds of unscripted celebration, and it launched a conversation about this partnership that went far beyond a single made basket. So, what is actually going on between these two? Is this the natural warmth that develops between any two players who share a backcourt long enough? Or is there something more specific, more deliberate, and more meaningful happening inside this particular Fever locker room? Because when you start stacking the evidence, the comments, the roster decisions, the injury-tested season, the reciprocal praise, the picture that emerges is a lot more interesting than one viral bench reaction. Let's get into it. The play itself wasn't complicated to describe, but it was genuinely difficult to execute. Kelsey caught a pass on the wing with a defender already closing hard, rose into her shooting motion, felt contact on the way up, and released the ball cleanly through all of it. No hesitation, no adjustment, just the kind of mechanical confidence that only comes from having made that exact shot thousands of times before, in practice, in preseason, in regular season games where nobody outside Indiana was paying much attention. What made the moment land differently wasn't the shot, it was what happened immediately after it. Specifically, Clark's reaction from the bench, and then, 2 days later, her description of that reaction when a reporter brought it up during a scheduled media availability. Clark called it cute. Not impressive, not incredible, not the kind of generic superlatives athletes reach for automatically when a microphone appears. She called it cute. And then she added a specific detail that most casual observers probably glossed over entirely. She suggested the shot might have caught Mitchell herself a little off guard, not because of the difficulty, not because of the contact, but because Mitchell almost never reacts outwardly to her own success. She almost never lets a moment register visibly on her face. That kind of composure, Clark implied, is simply the baseline for how Mitchell operates. Think about what that observation actually requires. To notice that a teammate almost never reacts outwardly to her own success, you have had to spend a significant amount of time watching that teammate closely. Not watching film, not studying statistics, but actually paying attention to the human being next to you during live action over the course of months. The observation is specific in a way that generic locker room positivity almost never is. Players asked to praise teammates on camera routinely reach for the same handful of phrases. Hard-working, great teammate, really stepped up. The language is safe because it's designed to be. Clark's comment operated on an entirely different frequency. She described Mitchell's internal emotional response to her own success. That's not something you notice unless you've been paying very close attention for a very long time. It also fits a pattern that broadcast cameras have documented repeatedly throughout the season. Clark and Mitchell communicating between possessions on the bench, pointing out defensive coverages, celebrating each other's baskets with a familiarity that doesn't look performed. None of that footage proves anything definitive about how these two players feel about each other in private, but it does establish that what the cameras keep catching isn't a single isolated moment taken out of context. It's a consistent, repeated pattern across an entire season of games. That distinction matters enormously when you're trying to separate genuine chemistry from manufactured narrative. The clip of Mitchell's shot and Clark's reaction spread quickly, much faster than most regular season highlights travel, especially for a game that wasn't a nationally broadcast marquee matchup. That speed says something worth examining about the specific audience that has grown around this Fever roster over the past couple of seasons.
A significant portion of the people following Indiana closely right now arrived specifically because of Clark. Her entry into the league generated a level of attention the WNBA hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. And that attention brought a fan base that was already deeply invested in her before she played a single professional minute. That kind of pre-existing investment in a player tends to expand outward over time. Fans who arrive for one player eventually start paying attention to the people surrounding that player. And what this particular fan base found when they started looking at the roster around Clark was Mitchell, a 9-year veteran who had been quietly excellent in Indiana long before the spotlight arrived. But the Clark effect alone doesn't fully explain why this specific partnership has generated so much sustained public interest. Plenty of superstar arrivals come with established veterans who absorb some secondary attention. Most of those pairings generate a wave of interest early and then fade into the background as the team's storyline moves in other directions. What has kept the Clark-Mitchell dynamic in constant conversation is the way Clark specifically has talked about Mitchell in public. Not in the way athletes typically talk about teammates, but in a way that is precise, repeated, and pointed at specific skills and specific moments rather than diffuse general praise. Fans picked up on that distinction early. Each new Clark comment about Mitchell got received not as a routine media obligation, but as further evidence of something that already had a well-established narrative around it. The three-pointer against the Liberty, the bench celebration, the post-game comment about Mitchell's composure, none of it would have traveled the way it did if it hadn't landed inside an audience already primed to interpret every public interaction between these two as meaningful. A made three is a made three. A made three followed by a specific, affectionate, psychologically observant comment from the sport's most watched player about the teammate who made it is a completely different kind of story. One that spreads well beyond the usual audience for late-season, regular-season highlights. The bench reaction and the media comment gave the public a small window into how Clark thinks about Mitchell in real time. But the fuller picture had actually surfaced earlier in the year, inside a team-produced profile video built specifically around Mitchell's career and game. These kinds of team content pieces are common across professional sports. Players are asked to offer brief thoughts about a featured teammate, the camera rolls for a few minutes, and the organization packages the nicest quotes together into something watchable. Most players treat these segments exactly the way you'd expect. A compliment or two, something about work ethic, something about being a great teammate, and then wrapping up quickly. The formula is so predictable that most fans watch these pieces without registering any individual quote as particularly meaningful. Clark didn't follow the formula. Asked to share her thoughts on Mitchell, she built a detailed, structured case. She described Mitchell as someone with no better backcourt partner in the entire league. Then she got specific. Mitchell's speed relative to the rest of the Fever roster, her ability to create separation as a cutter before the defense can recover, her shooting touch, which allows her to punish any defense that gives her a fraction of daylight, and then the detail that stands out most to anyone who has spent time around competitive basketball, her commitment on the defensive end, from baseline to baseline, across the full length of the court for an entire game. That last point is the one that matters most. Praising a teammate's scoring is the path of least resistance in any media setting. It's the easiest claim to support statistically, the safest thing to say, and the one least likely to generate any kind of controversy or follow-up question. Praising a teammate's willingness to defend the full length of the court without complaint, an aspect of the game that rarely shows up in any highlight package and almost never gets its own dedicated broadcast moment, is an entirely different kind of compliment. It's the kind of specific respect that usually lives only inside practices and film sessions, where a player has watched a teammate grind through the unglamorous parts of the job night after night, without anyone in the arena or at home noticing. The fact that Clark brought it up in a public setting, unprompted, while still managing to make it sound like an obvious observation rather than a calculated talking point, tells you something real about how closely she has studied her backcourt partner's game.
She closed the comments by calling Mitchell a good teammate and a good person. Basketball praise and character praise side by side, in a setting where most athletes stick entirely to the safer lane of basketball praise and nothing else. It's a small detail, but it's worth noting because it's unusual. The line between professional respect and genuine personal regard is one that athletes are typically very careful not to cross in scripted team media moments. Clark crossed it without appearing to think twice. A separate clip from the same period reinforced the theme in a lighter context. During a team content segment, Clark was handed a phone and asked to pass it along to the next player. She introduced Mitchell as the fastest player in the league. Not on this roster, in the league. It's an assertive claim in a sport that has no shortage of exceptionally quick guards, and Clark made it without hedging, without qualifying it as an opinion, and without the kind of self-deprecating humor athletes often use to soften a bold statement before anyone can push back on it. She said it, handed the phone over, and moved on, as if it were simply a fact she had already settled in her own mind a long time ago. Compliments are easy to manufacture. Roster decisions are not. During the offseason following that injury-shortened season, Mitchell entered restricted free agency for the first time in her career. Restricted free agency carries genuine uncertainty for even the most accomplished veterans. Other franchises can submit formal offers. The original team then has to decide, quickly, whether matching that offer makes financial sense against a roster already built around a substantial contract at the top. The calculus isn't always straightforward, and plenty of valuable players have been lost in exactly that scenario, simply because the math didn't work out cleanly enough for the original team to move fast. The Fever didn't hesitate. Mitchell became the very first player the organization re-signed once the free agency window officially opened. Not one of the first, the first. Before any other roster question was addressed, before any other position was evaluated, before any competing offer from another franchise could even materialize into a live negotiation, Indiana moved to lock Mitchell in. That sequencing is a statement. Front offices don't make their first move of an offseason randomly. They make it based on a clear internal hierarchy of what the roster needs most urgently to remain competitive. The fact that Mitchell was that first move tells you precisely where she ranked in Indiana's internal evaluation of its own roster, ahead of every other piece, ahead of every other need, and ahead of every potential upgrade the organization might have been considering elsewhere on the floor. It's worth asking why a franchise built around one of the most recognizable players in the sport moved fastest to secure her backcourt partner above all other priorities. The answer aligns almost perfectly with what Clark had already been saying publicly for months before the free agency window opened. A front office doesn't need its franchise players' public praise to make a sound roster decision. Analytics, salary structure, and coaching input drive those conversations long before sentiment enters the room. But when the star's specific, repeated, unscripted praise of a teammate and the front office's urgent roster prioritization point in exactly the same direction, the compliment stops looking like a talking point and starts looking like an accurate read of the roster's actual hierarchy of value. The two things aren't connected by coincidence. They're connected because they're both describing the same reality from different angles. None of the praise, none of the roster decisions, and none of the fan attention carries its full weight without the season that came before. And that season was defined almost entirely by absence. A series of lower body injuries limited Clark to just 13 appearances. For a franchise that had built its entire national identity around one player's arrival, that injury timeline could have unraveled the season completely, both competitively and in terms of the public attention the organization had worked hard to build since Clark was drafted. when the player everyone came to see is unavailable for the vast majority of the schedule, the expected outcome for a young franchise in that position is regression, fewer wins, reduced engagement, and a prolonged wait for the following year when health presumably returns. That's not what happened. Mitchell absorbed the difference. She stepped into the role of primary offensive option without a co-star alongside her to pull defensive attention away from the perimeter, without the benefit of a second scoring threat that opposing defenses had to account for every possession. And she produced at a level that kept Indiana not just alive, but genuinely competitive through the second half of the season.
The results defied almost every reasonable external expectation. The Fever won their franchise's first Commissioner's Cup. They finished the regular season 24-20, their best record in years, and a mark that looked almost impossible to project at the start of a year that immediately lost its most prominent piece to injury. They advanced to the playoff semifinals, where they pushed a deep, experienced Las Vegas roster to 5 games before the season ended. Should a team missing its most prominent player for the majority of a season have performed anywhere near that well? Honestly, no. Under normal circumstances, that kind of absence produces a lost season. The player most responsible for defying that expectation was the same one Clark would later describe, without hesitation, as the best backcourt partner in the league. Mitchell didn't just maintain the roster's baseline competitiveness in Clark's absence, she elevated it to a level that neither outside analysts nor the broader WNBA audience had anticipated going into the year. That postseason run in particular added a layer to the story that numbers alone don't fully capture. Playoff basketball operates at a different intensity than the regular season. The margin for error shrinks, the opposing adjustments come faster and hit harder. Performing effectively as a primary option under that kind of pressure in a 5-game series against one of the league's most experienced rosters requires a different kind of trust in your own game than regular season production provides. Mitchell banked that experience during a stretch of the season when nobody outside Indiana was particularly focused on what she was doing. And that experience became part of what made the backcourt pairing look so seamless and so confident once Clark returned to full health. The admiration in this partnership doesn't run in one direction. On a podcast hosted by a decorated former point guard, Mitchell was asked directly whether Clark's arrival had created any friction inside the Fever locker room. It's a fair and reasonable question. Clark arrived as the most hyped incoming player the league had ever seen, became the face of the franchise almost immediately, and reshaped the team's entire public identity within a single season. Veterans in that situation across professional sports history have responded in a wide range of ways, and not all of them have been graceful. Mitchell's answer focused on nothing else but basketball. She talked about temperament. Specifically, she described watching Clark's competitive intensity and investment in the team stay completely consistent whether Clark was healthy and on the floor contributing or sidelined and physically unable to help. That consistency, Mitchell said, was what she respected most, because it would have been easy to check out. A young superstar forced to watch from the sideline while her team navigates a difficult season without her has every social permission to quietly disengage, to be present without being invested, to show up to games and practices without bringing the same energy that the role requires when you're actually playing. Mitchell's account suggests Clark did the opposite. She stayed invested in a season she could not physically help win. She remained emotionally connected to teammates who were carrying the weight in her absence. That behavioral consistency under the worst circumstances for a competitor, being unable to compete, is not a universal trait. Plenty of players, including plenty of genuinely talented ones, can't sustain that level of investment when the season has effectively moved on without them. Mitchell noticed that Clark could, and she respected it specifically because she understood how unusual it was. She also noted something broader about the two players sharing a fundamental love for the game itself, describing it simply as both of them loving basketball the same way, despite having different individual styles and different roles on the floor. That framing recontextualizes the entire relationship in an interesting way. Clark's praise of Mitchell centers on production, specific, measurable, box score visible contributions. Mitchell's praise of Clark centers on character, the behavioral consistency under adversity that no box score ever captures. Two completely different types of compliments pointed in opposite directions, describing the same dynamic from entirely different vantage points, each one making the other more credible by existing independently.
The timing of Mitchell's comments matters as well. They were recorded well before the Fever entered the offseason that would turn Mitchell's own future into an active storyline. She spoke about Clark's steadiness during a period when her own roster spot wasn't yet a live question. There was no strategic incentive to say the right things about her backcourt partner. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to protect, nothing to gain from public warmth toward a teammate. She said what she said because it reflected what she had actually observed. That context makes the praise considerably more credible as an honest account of the relationship, rather than a calculated one shaped by circumstances. With Clark healthy again, and both players operating at full strength for the current season, what the Fever now have in their backcourt is something most organizations spend years and significant resources trying to construct intentionally and still fail to produce. Two guards who can each anchor an offense independently, who also happen to elevate each other further when both are on the floor at the same time, and who trust each other's tendencies under pressure because they have already been tested under the worst possible version of those circumstances. That trust didn't come from a summer of team-building activities. It didn't come from a front office identifying two compatible skill sets on paper and hoping chemistry would follow. It came from a season in which one player had to become something she wasn't originally asked to be, succeeded at it convincingly, and earned a level of respect from her returning teammate that no scouting report or analytics package could ever fully quantify. Coaches often talk about depth as a function of roster size or statistical redundancy, but the version of depth the Fever demonstrated during that injury-shortened season is far more meaningful than either of those things. It's the proof that the partnership can function at a high level, even when the circumstances are at their worst. And that proof doesn't expire when conditions improve. It becomes part of the foundation that the relationship is built on going forward. The July bench reaction, the viral clip, the comment about Mitchell's composure, the profile video, the re-signing decision, the injury-tested season, the podcast interview. None of these things exist as separate, isolated stories. They're all part of the same accumulating picture of a partnership that has been tested repeatedly, praised specifically from both sides, and protected deliberately by the organization responsible for building around it. One teammate calling another the best backcourt partner in the league doesn't mean much by itself. But pair it with a re-signing decision that prioritized her above every other roster need, an injury-tested season in which she proved that claim on the floor, and reciprocal praise from the other player that focuses not on basketball ability, but on character under adversity. And it stops looking like a compliment. It starts looking like an accurate scouting report on exactly what has made this particular Fever roster work. The story of Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell isn't really about one three-pointer, or one viral bench reaction, or one warm comment in a press conference. It's about trust built over parts of 3 seasons, through the glamorous moments and the ones nobody was watching. Respect earned under pressure when it would have been easier for both players to take the path that required less of them. And chemistry that kept growing precisely when the spotlight was at its most unforgiving. As Indiana continues building toward what it genuinely believes is a championship-caliber roster, one question lingers. Could this backcourt be remembered as the partnership that turned the Fever into a real title contender? The evidence is mounting, and it's getting harder to argue against.